Okay. Thank you. We can try that again. Thank you. So I'm going to start over. My name is Madeline Keating. I am a city strategist with the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC. We are an environmental advocacy organization based in the United States, and we work on a wide array of climate issues related to ranging from protecting our public lands to energy efficiency to sustainable food systems. One of the things that we do is work on food waste reduction as part of our food waste team. Our food waste team works on a variety of different issues related to federal advocacy on food waste reduction, working with states to pass statewide food waste reduction laws, and then working with city governments to develop innovative solutions, policies, and partnerships related to food waste reduction. This is a little bit more about what NRDC does. So I just want to ground us before I ask our speakers to come up and join me today. Why are we all here talking about food waste at the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact? About 40% of our food in the United States is wasted. Globally, it's about 8 to 10% of greenhouse gas emissions from food loss and waste. And so addressing food waste is a key component of a more sustainable and resilient food system. By addressing food waste, we are simultaneously addressing inefficiencies within our food system and ensuring that we are prioritizing the food that is getting grown for people so that it does not make its way into our landfills. And so NRDC has really prioritized this work because we understand that not only is food waste contributing to methane emissions and global greenhouse gas emissions, but it's also a major climate justice issue. When food is going to the landfill instead of being eaten, it means that people that need that food are not getting good, high-quality food that has been raised with all of the resources going into it for, like I said, people. Project Drawdown lists reduced food waste as the #1 climate solution for a 2-degree change in temperature, in 2 degrees Celsius temperature rise. So addressing food waste is something that sometimes doesn't make its way into climate conversations as readily as we'd like, but all of us here today know that it is immensely important. So I just want to talk a little bit about why NRDC is in this space. We are working with cities across the United States to develop innovative program and policy solutions to reduce food waste. We see cities as key partners on reducing food waste because so frequently they are in charge of their own municipal waste costs. They have food insecurity goals to ensure that their residents are being fed good, nutritious food. And cities work well when they work together, as many of you here know. Shared learning is a really great opportunity to not reinvent the wheel for all of these food waste solutions. So what a city like Chicago is working on could really benefit a city like London, because those cities might share similar goals and approaches to their work. Through our Food Matters initiative, we have worked with cities at a number of different levels, from getting a baseline assessment of how much food is going to waste across sectors and where what sectors waste the most food, to coming up with a programmatic solutions for how cities can be key partners in rescuing more surplus food so that it can go to residents who need it. So of our cities, which are many, I'm going to be joined today by 3, Chicago, Cincinnati, and DC. And I would like to call each of our speakers up one by one. So first, from the city of Chicago, the mayor's sustainability team with the city of Chicago, we've got Gabby Wagner-Sobrero. Gabby is an environmental policy advisor and is one of our Food Matters partners. So Gabby, come on up. With the Office of Environment and Sustainability for the City of Cincinnati, we've got Ollie Kroner. Ollie is the Director for Sustainability with Cincinnati and also a Food Matters City with NRDC. So Ollie, you can come up, please. And then, last but not least, Caroline Howe. Caroline is with the Department of Small and Local Business Development with the City of Washington, D.C. Caroline runs the Food Waste Innovation Grants programs as well as the Aspire Program Coordinator. So Caroline, come up. So thank you all so much for being here today. I'm excited to talk to you all about food waste in cities. I'm going to keep this slide up just so everyone knows who's who as we're talking. I do want to pass the mic down briefly and just hear from each of you. Who are you? Why are you working on food waste? And what are you most excited about in your city related to food waste? Yeah, let's start with you, Gabby.
Hi, everyone. Like Maddie said, my name is Gabby Wagner-Sobrero. I live in Chicago. Has anyone ever visited Chicago, by the way? All right, a few of you. Nice, nice. So if you have visited Chicago, or even as you can tell on the map, Chicago is located in the Midwest region. We buddy up next to Lake Michigan. It's probably one of our biggest natural assets. And food waste is really important to us, and also reducing food waste, and also thinking about food insecurity and food, hunger, all of those things combined. Chicago, real quick, the history of the city is very segregated. It is a very mixed city. 2.7 inhabitants live there. So we have a lot of mouths to feed, right? And there's also a big landscape, right, in terms of thinking of how big and massive the city is. What we've seen is, a lot of disparity between where food is available, and then also there's a correlation with that in waste as well. And so the city in itself has, kind of struggled a little bit to reduce the number, divert food from landfill. And for like one of the first times, it seems, we're getting participation from different departments. There's that collaboration, not contamination, collaboration. And so it's really exciting to be working on food waste, really. So excited to talk more.
Nice, Gabby. Ollie Kroner, City of Cincinnati. Who's heard of Cincinnati? Okay, a few. Not quite as big as Chicago or DC, but we are a population of 310,000 in a metro of about 2.5 million. So we have a sizable footprint. A little bit of history about our city. There was a time during our growth where there were more pigs in Cincinnati than humans. And it was the center of our economy, so much so that the city was called Porkopolis. And at the time, you used every scrap of anything you could get. But lard was harder to find a use for until two men by the last names of Procter and Gamble discovered that it could be used for soap and candles. So how many of you washed your hair this morning? How many of you brushed your teeth? So chances are that you used the product that originated in the city of Cincinnati. So I just want to point out that we are literally on the map today because two gentlemen figured out how to turn food waste into a resource. And of course, that's not the end of the story. So more to talk about, but that sets the stage.
All right. Well, thank you to you both. I'm Caroline Howe. I'm with the District of Columbia, which is the United States capital. We are also a city in our own right and a future state. We are en route to be the 51st state in the US, and that is really important to us that currently, as the district, we are in a really strange place. We're not yet a state with the rights and abilities of a state, but we're also not just a city because we don't have a county or a state above us as other cities in the US do. So that's certainly part of our history. I really appreciate everything that's been said. while our city is, of course, a federal capital, it's also home to hundreds of thousands, 700,000 residents. And as with many other cities in the US, has an incredible history of redlining and segregation based on race, and that's really still present in our geography and in our food system. To Maddie's point of why I'm so excited to be here to work on food waste, I am an entrepreneur. I work in our Department of Small and Local Business Development, and the businesses that I started before joining the district government were focused on food and food waste. I ran an ugly fruit popsicle company, started composting companies all over the world, and have been a part of food waste in so many different ways, but hadn't been able to bring it to a city level to really be thinking about how we can be engaging the private sector, our small businesses, in tackling food waste. And that's why I'm so excited to be here today to share more about how we've been able to do that as the district.
Thank you all so much. So we've got a fun and exciting discussion in front of us. So I just want to ground us first before we get too deep into this discussion. The four of us are going to chat a little bit, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. And our hope is to spend the last section of this time together to kind of break into small groups and learn from each other and discuss what each of you is doing in your own cities as well as barriers and opportunities. So we're going to end the session that way, and so keep in mind, what do you want to ask these panelists, but also what do you want to learn about from each other? So that's where we are going today. So to start us off, we heard a lot in that opening session about the need for climate justice and climate resilience. And like I said, sometimes food waste doesn't make it into the forefront of those discussions. Yet all of you are here today. So why is this issue a priority in your city, and what are some of the top things that you are doing to address food waste? Why don't we start this time with Ollie?
Sure. So, important context. We are a city of 52 communities, and one of our metrics is life expectancy by neighborhood. And from one neighborhood to another in Cincinnati, we have a 25-year gap in how long people live. You know, so if we're talking about inequity, this is the heart of it, right? And you know, it's due to a variety of factors, but certainly most of the data I have seen, diet is the primary driver of life expectancy. So I think we really saw the worst of things through the COVID pandemic, where we see how a crisis really exploits vulnerabilities. And if we know one thing about the climate crisis, and the way it presents today and the way it projects to move forward, it's a risk multiplier, right? So it takes existing vulnerabilities, people on the cusp of catastrophe, and exploits that. So when we look at poverty, when we look at life expectancy, this is a core issue. And I think Maddie outlined this in a nice way. When we live in a place where some of our residents report struggling to afford food or struggling to shop for food because it's not in proximity to where they live, and then we have others that are so affluent that they don't even use 40% of what they're buying, and what are we doing? What kind of world have we created? So food waste is at the heart of our climate equity and climate resilience work. And then we're getting into strategies now also.
Why don't we start there and then we'll do strategies?
Yeah, so one thing that's exciting about the district's perspective on both climate, food, and waste is that we actually developed our Sustainable DC plan in 2012 before the city had a climate action plan, for better or worse. But the Sustainable DC plan set the district's goals on reaching our emissions reductions targets in energy, in transportation, and in both food and in waste. So it set a zero waste goal for the city of diverting 80% of all waste, doubling our recycling rates, and cutting food waste by 50% by 2032. So we already had goals around food waste since 2012, and those were really updated in 2017 to bring much more of a focus on equity in our food system into those food and climate goals. It's still a challenge because of the way that climate and energy and buildings sit in one district agency, while questions of transportation are managed by another, waste by yet another, and food, of course, cuts across every single one of those. And particularly, as I mentioned, with such segregation in our city, transportation and access to transportation is so tightly tied to food that if you can only afford to go to the grocery store once every 2 weeks, you will have more food waste because you simply, or you will be eating exclusively shelf-stable and canned foods. And so it is so important to recognize that these are so connected. I think we also see food waste and climate in so many of the communities that we work in. When we talk about how you make climate really real to someone, we are feeling now more and more extreme heat and extreme flooding, but food and food waste is such an immediate way that people can also feel able to take action. So it's another way that we see food and food waste really connecting to our climate action as a way to be the entry point for action.
So for Chicago, being the third largest city in the US, I think that there's sort of some accountability and responsibility to act up and do something around food waste. We typically use LA and New York as our comparison cities and gauge, where they're at. And in terms of food waste, right, Chicago is like far below in terms of what we were actually doing. So that kind of set already a sort of pressure, I will say, that was really important and intended to get folks to be more aligned and just be more actionable around food waste. I will say that the narrative that we often get is, well, we don't recycle well, so how are we going to do food well, right? And how are we going to compost, or how will that even work? And so it's really exciting now, from my point of view at least, to be working with folks across our departments who are also interested in implementing some food waste strategies, and treat it almost as like an experiment, honestly, and see how it goes. And rather than taking the other side of, well, this is impossible, like this isn't going to work because of X, Y, and Z, really just taking the risk and seeing what sticks, what doesn't, and then, again, trying to recalibrate and make things stronger and more efficient.
Great, thank you all. I think that that's something that's so true, something that all of you kind of touched on, which is this piece that climate solutions can be really like big and scary and not very tangible, but food, especially food waste, is very tangible. It's something where you can meet people literally in their kitchen, in their like food memories and with their emotions, where they are culturally, and say, do you really want to throw that food away? And that's something we see across so many cities, is that this is something that we can all connect to every day. And that really resonates, especially with higher level elected officials and funders, for that matter, which we know is all important to us all as well. So to that end, all of you are doing really innovative things to address food waste. And it is very interesting in cities, especially in the US, where we don't have like consistent organics collection, say, across the country. Cities kind of have to get scrappy. And all of you are at different levels in terms of what state policies you have that are influencing you at the municipal level and the level of elected official buy-in on this issue. What are some of the places that you've found opportunities to reduce food waste and kind of run with those examples for innovative strategies? Caroline, why don't you get started?
Thank you. Yeah, so one way that we were able to really move food waste action is that in the District of Columbia, we have an urban rodent problem. And depending on what city you are from, you might have a different kind of urban rodent. Some cities have raccoons, opossums. We have rats, and we have very large rats. And that is also a problem that our businesses care about, that residents care about. And so we have actually really pushed open the door on food waste action by addressing rats. So how we did that for 7 years, the District of Columbia was funding a program for businesses to implement trash compactors. So simply to compact all of a restaurant's trash so it would be rat-proof and so that it would be taking up less space in our very congested urban alleys. The problem with that, of course, is once trash is compacted, it is very challenging to separate. And so while, yes, they were perhaps compacting cardboard separate from everything else, there was no way to really get at the core. And so thanks to hearing from other cities and having the backing of cities like Denver that had been running food waste challenges in their restaurants, and hearing what Philadelphia was doing and getting restaurants to sign on, my team was able to make the case that we needed to change this compactor program to meet the sustainability goals I talked about already, which had been long in place before this compactor program began, and that if we really wanted to tackle rats in our city, we had to be tackling food that was feeding them, and that if we could actually get food waste out of these alleys, we could be addressing the rodents at source, and of course with other rodent interventions that continue. And that worked. And so I think by addressing a concern that all of these businesses had, while bringing in what I was able to learn from other cities through the Food Matters cohort, we were able to make the case for this $500,000 to be going towards food waste innovations in commercial corridors. So for the last 2 years, it is opening next Monday, the next round of these grants. But over the last year, we've been able to fund 22 businesses and commercial corridors to take really creative innovations in their food waste, and then to fund another 26 businesses to start composting for the first time. So together, those 48 businesses have actually been able to try separating their food waste, and all of the things we knew would come from that, which is once you start separating your food waste, you start seeing it. Once you start packaging the waste up to be able to donate it, you realize how much you were making. And for the people in the back of the kitchens, realizing their labor that was then just going into the trash. And to see the power of being able to donate that food through connections that have been made so that restaurants and small food makers are now donating hundreds of meals every day through this program. Businesses that had decade-old refrigeration that they were able to replace that was actually significantly reducing their food waste. Businesses that started producing on-site, a wine bar that's now growing all of the herbs for their cocktails outside in their garden, a pizza place that is growing and cultivating and dehydrating their own mushrooms for their pizzas because mushrooms spoil just so quickly. And so really creative ideas like that, but also flash freezing and new ways of production and lots of cross-utilization using broccoli stems and all of the other pieces we know from creative cooking. And so that's been really exciting, but it's also exciting to see what it's starting to change in commercial corridors by seeing that dozen businesses can come together and choose to start composting, to say, yes, we're all going to work with this same program so that once we're now all composting, well, what else might we be able to share? Might we be able to talk about collective hauling as this commercial corridor? And that's where I think some really exciting things are starting to grow and expand, because we're also working with the technical assistance providers in the district that help new food businesses get started. So now in 5 of our entrepreneurship programs in the city that teach new food businesses how to get licensed and how to price your products, they're also talking about food waste from the beginning of their businesses. The new businesses are excited, and we're really excited as the agency that supports new small business to see that this idea of zero waste is growing. So that's our business interventions. Luckily, my peers all over the city are doing creative community composting and expanding food donation and integrating these conversations around food and climate into more of the procurement questions across the district as well. So thanks.
So for Chicago, again, ground level, we do not have any composting, or did before. So that was like, okay, let's start there. Let's maybe start a pilot program to have folks in the community understand what composting is, how it works, and participate, right, in a more localized program. So That is one of the things that our Department of Streets and Sanitation has been helping implement, and there are 6 community gardens spread out throughout the city. Of course, for us, it was really important to stay true to our values on equity, so thinking about where are some really untouched or hard-to-reach communities that typically don't receive this kind of resource, and work with a nonprofit community garden organization to do composting on site, so collect food scraps from people's kitchens. So this, of course, is small in scale, but the idea was, let's make something that's more publicly available, that, we're not charging people to participate in, which currently the city, right now, your only options are private hauling groups to compost with. And see how it goes, and see how people, their perception of it, gauge their curiosity. And our hope really is to build from that and learn from that, evaluate the successes and maybe the challenges and things that can be improved, so that we can expand and bring more community composting gardens to other neighborhoods across the city. In addition to that, we also received funding for a micro-hauling project, so that means picking up actual compost and food scraps from people's homes, and that's also a project that our Department of Streets and Sanitation is also leading. And then the more sexier project, I would say, is our Food Rescue Challenge, which is also with NRDC's support. And that is really a fun project to really kind of open up the conversation around food waste and food rescue with our business sector. So we chose the film industry because Chicago is known as a place where people film. Someone today asked me if I saw The Bear, so that is one show that's filmed there. And engage with studios and production companies on how they can rescue uneaten food from their catering, because usually they are catered, and work with a food rescue partner to redistribute that food into communities that will then consume the food, eat it, and therefore we don't end up with food at the end of the day in the trash. So we actually just launched that a few months ago, and one of the TV programs that helped was partner of that was South Side. So if anyone watches HBO South Side, that's also filmed in Chicago. And their director was really excited to partake in this challenge. And we got some recognition from local media. And after that article came out in the local newspaper, a lot of people started blowing up our lines, asking, I want to be a part of this. We got restaurants. I think we had other film groups, contact us asking, to learn more. And I think really that's where it starts, right? And no pun intended, there's an appetite, right, for this. And so I think starting the conversation was really important to us. And I sometimes giggle at the fact that we think innovation in Chicago is literally just starting a compost pilot, but that is opportunity to grow and learn from. And I think hopefully eventually we bring composting to across the city, and we're no longer number 3. So.
I like history. Many of us went to go see Christ the Redeemer, right? High view, beautiful. Cincinnati is also very hilly, but I'm sorry to say that the highest point in Cincinnati is our landfill. It's the Rumpke landfill, owned by the Rumpke family. It's the 6th largest in the country now, I believe. What's interesting, I talked about the pigs. Well, Rumpke was a pig farmer, and he set up a program where he would collect everybody's food waste to feed it to his pigs, and that's how he grew his farm. Until government said, no, that's too high risk for passage of disease. You can't feed food waste to animals that will be eaten. So we started piloting in his backyard because he already had all this business, and it's grown and grown and grown ever since. Alongside Procter & Gamble, we also have the Kroger Company, which is one of the largest food manufacturers in the U.S. So you can imagine we have a large commercial food production, food manufacturing footprint and food waste. So much so that it looks like an enormous business opportunity. And the city of Cincinnati partnered with a startup organization to offer commercial compost for these major food manufacturers. It went so well that within months, they were overwhelmed with waste in a way that they could not keep up with. So all of a sudden, we had this beautiful business solution turning into a literal stink. And the Environmental Protection Agency got involved, pulled the plug. The city's now stuck with the bill of remediating this site, which is now a decade later. Created all that talk about political will. It created enormous political distaste for food waste as a topic. So, in many ways, we wiped the slate clean and had to rebuild. Today, to touch on some initiatives that are different than what we've heard from colleagues, we're doing some similar work in some spaces, but we do have an anaerobic digester coming online. So some of this large-scale commercial waste will come and be processed in a digester, turned into a digestate that can be used as fertilizer, also biogas. I know many European colleagues are familiar with this technology. This is new for us, and we're excited about this new source of renewable energy and to divert this waste stream. One of the other spaces of food rescue innovation is we've had a startup organization called Last Mile Food Rescue emerge. They build themselves as the Uber for food rescue. Basically, any member of the community can sign up to join as a volunteer, and if you are in proximity of a company who has extra food, you'll be notified. You get a phone ding, and you can volunteer to deliver that food from point A to point B. Rescuing that food, they have saved over 3 million tons since their emergence. We also have some community compost pilot programs emerging as we try to build community will and experiment at a level that doesn't get onto the EPA's radar, given our troubled history here. So a lot of space where we're trying, we're innovating, we're piloting, and like my colleagues, super thankful for NRDC's coaching through this process as we learn from our peers.
Thank you all so much. And I will just say, some of you mentioned NRDC's coaching. What we try to do is take what we're learning from each of these cities and turn them into resources that other cities can use. Because as each of these speakers pointed out, they saw barriers and turned them into opportunities at key moments to develop these strategies. And it's likely that other cities, that our peers, are also seeing those same opportunities. And so that's what we try to do. For example, in DC, they said that rats were a big issue, so we worked with an organization called the Institute for Local Self-Reliance to co-develop a rats guide to reduce rats at community composting sites. And when we started telling other cities about this rats guide, everyone was excited. It was the talk of the town, because turns out there's rats in almost every city. One of our colleagues recently released a bear's guide, because it turns out that that's another rodent in our city of Asheville. So last week was Bear Week in the United States, where we vote on the fattest bear in one of Alaska's national parks. And so even that is relevant to food waste. But I think all of you just really highlighted that there are really unique considerations in each of your cities. One of the things that's interesting about talking about food waste in an international context is that there are a lot of things in the United States that are probably very different than some other countries. For example, Ollie mentioned EPA regulations. We're trying to always kind of skirt that boundary so that you're not like pushing up against certain permitting issues, which is why one of the strategies that a lot of cities work on is community-based composting, because there's not a lot of funding for large-scale composting infrastructure. There's a lot of permitting for large-scale composting infrastructure, and it's not universal across cities. So what are some of the ways that we can create smaller, that community-oriented solutions that work across cities? So I want to talk a little bit more about that. What are some of the biggest barriers that you are running into as US cities? Because I think that that is probably something really interesting to bring to these discussions that we're going to have after this conversation. What are some of the biggest barriers to implementing food waste reduction in your city? Does anyone want to volunteer to start this time?
I can go. I've had the opportunity to share battle stories with European colleagues, and every time I'm struck by the fact that so many climate solutions in Europe are regulatory in nature. And when I come home, we don't have the authority to do so. And you see in the US, so many of the climate solutions are actually market solutions. And government steps in when the market is not doing the job. So market forces are one of our primary struggles in this space. You know, I mentioned we have this giant landfill. We have that giant landfill because we have the lowest cost to landfill in the country. It's very cheap, so cheap that the states all around us send their waste to us, right? So when you want to stand up a business to do compost, who's willing to pay $70 extra per month to do that, right? There are a handful, but it makes it very difficult to make an economic case. You mentioned that we have different regulatory contexts. Cincinnati's in the state of Ohio. We are one of a handful of states that does not have a state climate action plan. And in many ways, it feels like the state is doubling down on climate inaction. You know, we've passed a bag ban in our city, and within 3 months, the state said, no, it's illegal to ban bags. As cities talk about moving away from natural gas infrastructure, the state has passed law that cities are not allowed to move away, pass policy to move away from gas infrastructure. So we have this real tug of war between local policy, state policy, and the market is not doing us any favors. So where we're not strong in terms of authority, we have to rely on scrappiness. So this looks like community partnerships. And almost everything we've done has been through building alliances among citizens or grant funding. You know, our compost program is funded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. NRDC's technical analysis is through a grant. So we work very hard to seek partnerships, build partnerships, and build a movement, build a coalition of residents who are concerned about this and will give voice to the issue. So big challenges.
Also big challenges. I think where my mind goes is, well, there's a few directions it goes. I think for one, culturally speaking, there's misalignment at times. So in terms of how we treat waste or think of waste, even if it's food or not food, I think that there is this sense of just being able to dispose whatever isn't used, right, in whatever kind of way. And there's less consideration of sort of the last mile of where that item, food, whatever product ends up. And so I think that there needs to be a little bit of that mindset shift to explain the importance and then also kind of zoom out as to how this all also is ingrained in climate action and climate change, and how playing a role in just like the everyday, you know, disposing of food or, you know, saving food, giving away food, those are all like things that we should all be kind of participating in our own will. So some of that is cultural, right? But also I will say that one of the big hurdles is working in a space where there's not a lot of staff to dedicate time to composting, for instance, in Chicago. And so I work with a staff of 5 people on our team, and we're all situated in the mayor's office. And then I work with the Department of Streets and Sanitation, and there's 2 people there working on composting things. So me, 2 of those people, plus 1 person from my team, that's 4 people working for 2.7 million people, right, in the city. So just the scale of that and sort of the discrepancy of how much staff is able to support, that's where it becomes an afterthought, quite frankly, because there's other priorities or other things in mind that the composting is kind of like the last thing that people have time to do. So I think that's kind of the big hurdle, and fortunately with funding comes the accountability, right? So once you already have, money that is allocated towards, in this case, the micro-hauling and the community composting, it's money, putting money where our mouth is, and actually now implementing those programs in the city and seeing how they work. So yeah, I think those are some of the really big elephants in the room.
Oof. Thank you. I mentioned earlier, we are a very small city in terms of our physical footprint, and we are surrounded by two totally separate states. And so in that space where we do not have the same regulatory or just infrastructure capacity, the district is very confined when we've looked for space to have larger biodigesters or composting facilities. We're just really quite packed in to the district. And so I think in that case, as many other cities are, space is a real constraint. And Virginia and Maryland, our neighboring states, do have much more space, do have larger scale composting infrastructure, but then you head into this challenge of an environmental justice question and a carbon question of transporting food waste these far distances. So while we are expanding, the district has had for almost a decade a network of 32 community gardens across it's currently at 32, that are operating their own composting facilities that are under 1 ton per week, because that is the regulation under which they would otherwise need solid waste landfill permits, essentially. And so that's been really exciting to see what can happen, but again, also this barrier of both some legislative, some space. I think another, and then I was mentioning to some folks while we were at the very beginning before we started, the idea of really coordinating across businesses in an environment where there is such an American idea, certainly true in the district, that this is my business, I get to make my choice. And so the idea of I get to choose my waste hauler, I get to choose what I'm doing with my scraps. And some people, that means that there's real innovators, it means that there's real leaders, but it also means that there are people who have many other concerns and have and don't want anyone else to be telling them what to do. So the district actually is very progressive with our legislation, and so in the past 2 years, have passed bans on, we've had a styrofoam ban for a very long time, but passed bans on straws, passed bans on any disposable packaging, have proposed, have implemented legislation that will require the district to report on the carbon emissions of all food purchased by the district. But that doesn't include the food waste emissions from the district. So there are gaps, but these policies have passed. But in many cases, the burden of that still falls on our smallest businesses. Our businesses run by communities of color. And so that's one sort of challenge we see where I think this is true. I think is true everywhere, where there is one part of the government that is passing regulations, perhaps that is quite different from those implementing it and those supporting the people impacted by it. And so that's something that we as a non-regulatory agency really struggle with in being impacted and trying to represent our smallest businesses and having their voices heard while not letting that be an excuse for inaction. Because it's true that is often wielded by environmental opposition to say, oh, this will impact small businesses too much, as a reason to not take action from a regulatory perspective. But we can potentially be doing both if we're strategically working together and lifting those smaller businesses up.
Can I mention one other thing? Data. We have a variety of strategies in our climate action plan. I can tell you how much energy every building uses. I can tell you how many electric vehicles we have registered. I can tell you how many trees we planted. In the food space, one, cities are not responsible for capturing their emissions in their carbon inventory. So it's sort of a secondary effort, tertiary effort in some cases, to capture that and make sense of it. And it's just hard to measure. It takes effort. There are so many different characters involved. It's more amorphous than other spaces where we work. And we'll just mention that this is another space where NRDC is helping coach us do some analysis of our food waste stream to help us give a better sense of where strategies might lie.
Thank you all so much for that, and thank you, Ollie, for adding that at the end. Measurement and data is a really hard piece of this. One of the things that we always say is that, and Ollie and I were talking about this recently, that comparison to your neighbor is a really good driver for kind of consumer behavior change. But in your home, you can't like install a smart meter to measure your food waste like you can your energy efficiency. And so how do we get that equivalent in this space? And we're not there yet. There's a lot of tech companies and whatnot out there trying to figure this out, but like I said earlier, food is very emotional, it's very historical, it's very cultural, et cetera. So is waste. It's very private. And so how do you kind of tap into that? I will just add that at the national level in the United States, because there's a few policies that could be helpful in this space. There is a number of organizations, NRDC included, that have made recommendations for how the United States can make progress on food waste reduction. Those include things like more robust data and measurement, education for consumers so that consumers have the resources that they need to reduce food waste in their own homes, and infrastructure costs for things like large-scale infrastructure and enabling states and cities to pass the policies that they need so that we're keeping food out of the landfill. So there are conversations happening at the state and federal level, as I'm sure is happening across globally, and we're excited to see where cities and states and the federal government goes in the next few years. So I do want to open it up to questions. I think the best way to do it is to walk around with the mic. So why don't people raise their hands if they have a question, and I can come to you. Oh, there is a mic, perfect.
Thanks. That's really inspiring hearing you guys talk about the stuff that you do, because you're kind of at the forefront of this, and it feels to me that traditionally local authorities and municipalities have a limited set of tools that they can use to address this problem. And I was quite interested to hear you talk about the market versus regulation. And in the UK context, we have quite a few emerging businesses that are using apps and smartphone technology to help citizens reduce food waste. I wondered if you're seeing the same kind of thing in the States and if you're working with those companies to reduce food waste.
Yes, thank you for that. One thing that the district, in partnership with local university, has been running a climathon, which was started somewhere in Europe initially, and so we've been running the climathon annually for about a decade, and 3 years ago it was focused on food waste. And so during that, what was very exciting coming both in and out of that was many organizations really focused on doing some of that software development in a very local context. The benefit of something like an app is that it can be used anywhere if you change a few things on the back end. And so we've seen local organizations, in the end, many of them have been bought by larger app developers for things like, in addition to food rescue apps that enable volunteers, donors, and individual businesses to connect. There is always a little bit of people power on the back end of those apps, just because relationship building is so important in food donation. But those have been really exciting. And then I think equally in what has grown much, well, food rescue has grown very quickly in DC, but also coming out of that hackathon was an organization called Last Call, now called Too Good To Go. There's lots of similar models where restaurants can post at the end of the day food that they would otherwise be throwing away and sell it as sort of a surprise bag. So you might not know what especially with the rise of fast casual dining in the US, where it's a buffet behind glass that servers create mixed bowls or burritos for you. That type of food always has a lot of waste at the end of the day, so that your last customer can have all of the options. You essentially are guaranteed to be making food waste. But if you can sell a surprise bowl of whatever is left to customers, and that's been so popular, again, for businesses that while they might love to donate, it's really small volumes. So if I'm able to sell 5 meals, that's much more effective than me trying to get someone to transport 5 meals. And then I think some of the other software that we're seeing that's really exciting in the food waste and technology space is around really helping some of the larger sales organizations like supermarkets and stores like Kroger and other grocers really be able to move product more effectively, but bringing that down to a smaller scale where a small corner store can much better track their inventory that is about to expire, put that on sale for their customers. And then last but not least, two of the programs we funded with this year's Food Waste Innovation Grants were for individual businesses to build out their software to better manage their inventory, so that particularly those that make meals that are then distributed at many different places, so grab and go at an airport or a hospital. They also have vending machines with fresh, locally sourced food. They've been able to reduce their waste from 15% of all meals to 10%, which is still a lot. Luckily, the 10% that's wasted, that they're not able to sell, they're able to donate now through the same program. So that's exciting to see, but the inventory for their scale, for their costs, reducing waste from 15 to 10% is so substantial. And so I think that things like that, even though to me, they feel a little marginal, it is really exciting for the business to see it's making them so much more cost effective.
I've already talked about our app, but I do sense that there's tremendous momentum right now around ESG responsibilities in the US, and so you see more and more businesses as good actors. Big trend, rolling out all of these different programs. I just went, the sister who owns a restaurant, and during the pandemic, everything shifted to go. And if you've ever ordered carry out in the US, if you order a sandwich, then you get 14 forks, 13 ketchup packets. I mean, it's absurd, the amount of packaging that comes alongside of it. So there's been a push to be more mindful about that. If you're ordering a soup, you don't need the packet that has the knife, the fork, and the spoon, just the spoon. There are more options to do away with sort of the additional packaging that so typically comes with any carry-out order. So just minor addition there.
Well, and that actually, one of the things that's been great in terms of working with technology partners, the district actually did mandate and regulate all of the to-go software, which I discovered iFood here in Rio. But whatever those food apps are, they are now mandated to add in an opt-in. You have to opt in to getting cutlery with your order. And so that's been rolling, but it's been really interesting where it is a tiny software click, and it is a tiny bit of reading for a restaurant, a person bagging the meal. But that's an interesting mix of how regulation and technology, while people had sent petitions to Uber Eats for quite a while, for us in the district, that regulation was able to push tech companies to be a little better.
Hi, thanks so much. This has been really, really great. Funding is a persistent challenge kind of for all of you. I was wondering if your cities have looked at all at carbon credits and how, you could use food waste to generate carbon credits, which would provide sustainable funding.
Yes, we have looked at carbon credits, primarily around protecting land and protecting trees, not food waste prevention. And I would love to learn more if this is an opportunity.
One of the ways we've been looking at more sustainable funding regulation that's been proposed but not yet passed in the district is around banning food waste going in landfill containers for all commercial businesses, which would be rolling out over the next 3 years. And I think there's some debate. There are questions around fines that would then fund food waste mitigation programs. Currently that's what's been proposed. There's, and I think the other piece of that would be the other waste-related fines tied to the food industry, the packaging, the things like that, so that they could go back into more programs that are helping those smallest businesses actually meet the regulations. So we haven't looked at carbon credits. The only, what I will say is interesting, a piece of that, unlike so many of our European counterparts who do already have anaerobic digestion, the only anaerobic digestion we have is in our sewage treatment facility in the district. And so there have been frequent proposals to shred, condense, and without adding more demand on our strained sewer infrastructure, we could actually be processing food waste with that. However, the Environmental Protection Agency regulations actually require that if sewage is being processed with food waste, the carbon credit value and the market value of the methane are both lower. And so that's a fascinating, really strong disincentive for our water treatment facility to have any interest in processing food waste, unfortunately.
So we also haven't explored carbon credits, but I will say that Chicago last year had passed a $188 million budget towards climate justice environmental initiatives. That money was general obligation bond money, so there were strings attached to the bonds and the money. And so what I'm learning, at least, is great, there's more money in our pocket, but there are strings attached and there are limitations as to how that money can be used. So in the case of the food waste work, I think it's 6.5 million out of that 188 is allocated towards organics collections, but that money, for instance, can't fund staff. So we're still working with the 4 people to make it happen and find loopholes essentially to, actually implement. And they're, working with a partnering organization. There's things of that nature that can be involved. But all that being said, we are lucky and fortunate to have the biggest budget, honestly, around climate initiatives. But with a grain of salt that there are some limitations as to how those 188 can be spent.
Hello. Hello. Hi, thanks for this. This is super fascinating. I'm from Washington, D.C., so I could attest to the massiveness of the rats that are there, unfortunately. So a really quick question on food waste. Unfortunately, we're going through this massive global crisis, food price crisis. We're seeing high food price inflation across the world. What we're hearing a little bit is that, so part of the reason food is wasted is that it's not priced right. Now you're seeing skyrocketing food prices, and there's a suggestion that people are starting to value the scarcity of food and that it's sticky, so that you're gonna see lower food waste in the future because of COVID and the supply chain disruptions, and then also the current crisis. So are you seeing this in the cities you work in, and is there a way to coalesce around this unfortunate situation and push forward on consumer behaviors a little bit on this?
I really appreciate that question, and I think we're hitting the front side of that crisis in the sense of people struggling even more than they had been before to feed themselves, particularly in our lower income communities. And so I think that what we've also found is that and I think that Gabby was mentioning this earlier, that the different ways we need to talk to different communities, even the term food waste doesn't necessarily resonate as something that people want to take action on, but food economy or being more efficient with your food purchases really does resonate. And so we ran a program a few years ago in partnership with a community-based organization that was really working with households to start measuring their food waste every week, and really seeing for people to start as soon as they're seeing those numbers, which currently even our commercial composting companies don't give people their daily or their weekly collection numbers. But we saw that when people were actually measuring it, they were starting to make even these just tiny tweaks. We heard from people who said, oh, right, I don't give my kids a snack when they come home from school because I realized that they were then, or a smaller snack, because they were then not hungry for dinner and we were having all of this food waste at that meal. So these tiny tweaks that I think are the same kind of thing you will see as people start to realize what they need to do differently. I also see more of an appetite for some of the associated nutrition education programs that are helping people work through how we can be more effective with fresh produce, for example, which is honestly, the waste is something that when we're working with communities around increasing consumption of fresh local produce, the challenge of waste is something that comes up. I don't want to buy those greens that are going to spoil in 3 days, but thinking about how to use and preserve. And so I think, again, tying the different sessions that we will be connecting with over these next 3 days around how we're connecting nutrition education back to waste, I think is also an interesting part of how we make that stickier long term.
I would add that until we address food in excess, or not being able to access food, we're going to continue to also still have a big waste problem too. Maddie, you and I were just talking about this, where less food insecure places tend to over-purchase when they go to the grocery store and tend to buy more food than they need for, let's say, the week. And then the result is sometimes you end up with a lot of waste. So I think, it's not to say that, inflation and perhaps like the pandemic will see less waste, if in fact we may be seeing more, because we know that inflation makes prices rise, and depending on the rate of the inflation, it could vary from week to week, month to month. Is anyone here, by the way, from Argentina? I'm just wondering. No? Okay, so they have a really bad inflation problem. And it's so bad, and my parents are from there, it's so bad that you can purchase, let's say, a gallon of milk one day and it'll be $2, let's say, and then the next day it could go up to $5. So that is like, again, what people are dealing with, where they're trying to make it and trying to get by through the week. And so until we kind of address that, I think we're going to still have to, deal with the consequences of not having access to food and then over purchasing and having more waste.
I think it's a really thoughtful question, and really I have more questions than I have answers. I feel like there are a number of shifts happening right now. I mean, we're also seeing the Instacart home delivery subscribe to repeated purchases movement, and I don't know how that plays out. The data person in me would ask the question, how much of our food waste is post-consumer versus pre-consumer? And I can imagine inflation driving the post-consumer decision-making in a big way, but I know less about pre-consumer. Maybe that's data somebody else in the room has, but I do appreciate the question and the insight.
Just out of interest, we did a piece of work in London on the thing you were saying actually about the system, because we were trying to work out what the consumption emissions the consumption-based emissions of the food system were as opposed to the territorial emissions, to get it onto the agenda of COP26 to say, look, this is a big problem and here's why. And we discovered that all of the focus of local authorities is on post-consumer, it's on the citizen, it's on food waste. So all of our activity and the activity of local authorities was based on that. But we discovered that the amount of waste and loss leading up to the plate was equivalent to the amount of waste post-plate, I guess. So now we're convening a producers roundtable to have that discussion because, you know, there's 9 million Londoners and there's probably, I don't know, maybe 100 big companies that are responsible for 80% of that food waste. So it's a big conversation with a smaller group of people. So that's quite interesting.
That is.
Yeah, that's a really good point. This is something we've been talking about this weekend is consumption versus production metrics on greenhouse gas emissions and what the responsibility is on municipalities for that, especially with food, like more so than anything with food and ag. I will note also to your question, the average amount of income, household income that's being spent on food is so much lower than it used to be, which is, you know, that is like the biggest, at the crux of the problem of consumer food waste. I think that there is something, I want to expand on what Gabby was saying, which is, you know, one of our strategies in the United States is we need messaging and education to consumers about food waste reduction, but we don't want to play the blame game because, you know, while you might accidentally have parsley that goes bad in your fridge and you could have stored it differently, like the onus really shouldn't be on the consumer. There's like systems in place that are making that challenging. For me, it might be that like I didn't actually know I could freeze this food and like basically put the pause button on it. But for different households, especially households that are in different like socioeconomic settings, the way they're experiencing food and food waste looks much different. And this is something we've seen in a lot of cities. So to Gabby's point, like if you are going 3 neighborhoods over to get all your food for 3 weeks and you're battling things like affordable housing, lack of transportation, challenging childcare situation, challenging healthcare situation, you know, this is a thing you're gonna have to juggle, and storage information about your food would be really helpful, but really it would also be helpful to just have a grocery store in your neighborhood. And to that point, in the United States, what we've seen during COVID is that there's food being rescued and given to people that is really not culturally relevant. They don't know how to cook that food. They don't want to eat that food. Or in many cases, the United States Department of Agriculture is giving them a box of food by which what we've heard just isn't good food. And so to say to that household, this is your fault that the food is wasted, is not the right message. The message is that we need to rethink the system that made that food go into that house and have the assumption that those people should be thankful and eat it in the first place. And so that's where food waste and this whole conversation ties into the other components of the Law on Urban Food Policy Pact, is that while we do need to address food waste in cities, it is the symptom of a system that's not working effectively. And so how can we collaboratively come up with solutions that work across all of our issue areas on food access, food assistance, support to farmers so that they can have more opportunities to grow good food that is not overly subsidized. And I think that's where we can all really put our heads together this week and find a lot of good opportunities. So thank you for that question. We have about 12 minutes left. I just want to read the room a little bit. I know this is a great discussion, but one of our goals was to get you all talking to each other as well. I want to be cognizant that there are people in the room speaking different languages, so I do want to kind of open up so that we can have some just kind of networking and breakout sessions where people that are not just our panelists can discuss barriers, opportunities, and solutions. So I think we've brainstormed a few different ways to do this, and I'm gonna try something out. What I kind of want to do is just have everyone kind of stand up, stretch, and maybe turn to your neighbor or find someone that speaks a similar language to you or the same language, and just kind of ask, what are you doing in your city? What are you excited about? What is something you learned today? and see if that mingling will work, because we really want to stimulate some networking. So let's give that a try. Go ahead and stand up and move around the room or chat with your neighbor.
E os microfones estão carregados, dá para...
A próxima vez a gente explica melhor o roteirinho. Vou falar com a Serena.